I didn't find out my dad sold my cottage until he handed me a cashier's check across a sticky diner table and told me to make it stretch. The number stared up at me like a dare $15,000 in neat machine ink, while the booth's vinyl squeaked under my legs and the Tigers game murmured from a wall-mounted TV behind his shoulder. He said it like it was a generous favor, like winterizing a life could be done with a few crisp bills and a pep talk, and I kept my hands flat on either side of the plate so he wouldn't see them shake. It was the first Monday after Labor Day, the kind of warm where the air still smells like grill smoke and cut grass, even though school buses are back on their routes. We were 3 miles from the lake that held our cottage, my cottage, the one my mother left to me in a line of her while I'd read so many times I could see the wording when I closed my eyes. I had driven an hour from Grand Rapids because he said we should talk face-to-face instead of lawyer to lawyer, and I had taken the meeting because he was my father and the word lawyer made my stomach turn. "The market is softening," he said, sliding the check toward me with 2 fingers like a card trick. "I got out ahead for you. Taxes don't pay themselves. This will tide you over while you figure things out." The coffee tasted burnt and the air felt thick, and for a second the diner's copper ceiling tiles reflected my face back to me in a weird blur. I said, quietly, because other people were trying to eat pancakes in peace, "You sold it without telling me?" He rubbed the back of his neck the way he does when he's proud of a decision and wants to look modest. "Timing is everything," he said. "You'll thank me when you're not bleeding cash on docs and insurance." I didn't argue with him there because the breakfast rush was starting and the server had refilled my water twice, and all the words I wanted to say were too big to fit between the napkin dispenser and the salt shaker. I folded the check and slid it into my wallet next to a library card and the faded punch card from a bagel shop, and the paper felt wrong in that spot, like a pebble in a shoe. He reached for the bill even though we had already paid, a reflex more than a gesture, and said, "You can come by the house tonight. We need to box up your mother's things we kept at the cottage. The buyers get possession on Friday." My mouth went dry fast enough that I had to swallow before I could speak. "The buyers," I repeated, and I heard my voice catch on the plural. He nodded. "Young couple out of Chicago. Cash. Smooth deal. No fuss." The TV behind him showed a replay of a double down the line, and a man at the counter slapped the wood and said, "That's how you do it," and the contrast between the ease in his voice and the tightness in my chest made my face feel hot. "I'm going to need the contract," I said. "And the closing statement. And the will paperwork. This doesn't make sense." He shrugged like I had asked him to pass the ketchup. "Your aunt has copies of anything important. Talk to her if you don't trust me. But take the check, honey. It's a start." I walked out into the parking lot, and the sun bounced off the windshields like little warnings. The lake road runs parallel to the water for 2 miles and then dips into a stretch of small houses where people sell old fishing gear and mismatched dishes on Saturdays. A cardboard sign from the weekend's garage sale was still taped to a light pole, the word tools, underlined 3 times like a promise. I drove past the bait shop where the clerk knows my name and the speedboat rental place that always smells like gas and sunscreen, and I kept my eyes on the water because every time I looked at a house I saw a math problem I couldn't solve. The cottage sits on a point that catches a breeze when the rest of the shoreline goes still. In October, the maples go hot red and the dock creaks at night in a way that used to scare me when I was little until my mother told me it was just the lake breathing out the day. The gate was open when I pulled in, and there was a contractor's truck in the drive like a polite warning that the place was already being measured in dollars that had nothing to do with me. Inside, the air held the smell of lemon cleaner and old pine. The living room windows faced the water, and for years my mother kept the blinds half open so the morning threw a soft line across the rug. She said a lake view should arrive quiet. I stood there and felt the way the boards under my feet held the sun's warmth, and I tried to line up the simple fact, sold, with the way the air still carried the sound of geese like nothing had happened. My dad's voice came from the kitchen, easy like he was at a cookout. "We'll start with the glassware," he said, and he opened a box with the same care he uses on carburetors. I lifted a mug, and my fingers found the chip on the handle where my mother had once bumped it against the sink. He was humming a little, pleased with himself, and I set the mug down and said, "You can't sell something that isn't yours." He went still just enough to let me know he had heard me clearly. "Don't get dramatic," he said in a tone he borrowed from elders at church who like to settle arguments by lowering the temperature of the room. "The trust gave me authority to manage. Your mother didn't want you babysitting a house you'll barely use. You're 26. You need liquidity." My Aunt Denise arrived 20 minutes later with a casserole and the kind of efficient expression she wears when she expects chaos and plans to neutralize it with a list. She hugged me like she was clocking my temperature with her cheek, and then set the dish on the counter and said, "We don't have to fight today." I turned to her so fast the hair at the back of my neck stuck to my skin. "Did you know?" I asked. She flinched at the edge of my voice and then did that deliberate thing she does when she's choosing words. "I knew he was thinking about it," she said. "He asked me to call your mother's old attorney for a copy of the trust, a simple request, not a red flag. The market has been high all summer. You told me yourself the tax bill made you dizzy." My hands felt sticky even though I wasn't holding anything. "Thinking about it isn't selling it in a month," I said. "Thinking about it isn't sliding me a check like an allowance." My dad came back from the bedroom with a stack of quilts and said, like it was a joke that would land, "15,000 is not an allowance, kiddo. That covers a year of rent if you're sensible." I laughed once because the alternative was yelling and the walls didn't deserve that. "Not in this town," I said. "And not for a cottage you just sold for $1 million. He shrugged. After fees and repairs and the agent and the lawyer, he stopped because my face told him I was doing the math faster than he could pad it. The first police officer I spoke to on Wednesday morning at the township station had kind eyes and a firm line when he said, "This sounds like a civil dispute," which in this county is code for take it to a lawyer and try not to make our desk a complaint box for family inheritance fights. I filed an incident card anyway because paper matters even when people roll their eyes at it. On the way out, I listened to the local radio talk about a church rummage sale and a lane closure on US 31 for resurfacing, and the ordinary tone kept me from crying in the car. I drove to the county recorder's office because that's where grown-ups go when they want the truth that doesn't care about tone. The woman behind the glass partition asked for the address and my name and slid a stack of printouts to me with a practiced hand. I sat on a bench under a bulletin board advertising a pancake breakfast and a fall color tour and went through the pages with a highlighter I pulled from my purse. The deed transfer date was 2 Fridays ago. The sale price was listed at $1,020,000, and the seller was an LLC my dad had formed in May. I ran my finger under the LLC name like it could explain itself. The trust my mother created 6 years ago sat on a separate page with my name spelled right next to beneficiary, and my stomach did a slow turn. On the last page, a document called an assignment of beneficial interest moved the cottage to the LLC a month ago with a signature that looked like my father's usual sharp angles and a second signature line that simply said, "Consenting beneficiary." And then my name printed neat and wrong. Whoever had written it had drawn the loop in my last name like a person who thinks fancy makes things true. I took the stack straight to Aunt Denise because if I had to call the lawyer alone, I was going to throw up in the parking lot. She was kneeling in her garden pulling the last of the beans, and she wiped her hands on her shorts and read quietly while a blue jay yelled at us from the maple. "This is not how your mother wrote it," she said finally, and the relief made my knees feel weak. She put a right of first refusal in an addendum after your step-grandfather tried to offload his boat behind everyone's back. She wanted you to have the option to keep the place or to control the sale, not to watch it slip to an LLC and then a stranger. The words right of first refusal moved through my head like a slow train picking up speed. Where is that addendum? I asked. In her file, she said, and then she closed her eyes because she heard herself. At the house, I said. Where he has been boxing everything. She nodded. And at the attorney's office, she added, and the way she said it made me stand up straight. Call him, I said. Please. Today. I made the call from my car with the windows cracked because the air still held late summer heat and my palms were damp. The receptionist at the firm remembered my mother's name like a hymn and said Mr. Halpern could see me Thursday after lunch if I brought ID. I drove to the cottage one more time that evening, needing to be in the rooms while they were still ours in some small real way. The new buyers had left a note propped against a jar in the kitchen, polite and cheerful, with a phone number and a line about how excited they were to watch the sunsets from the deck. And my chest tightened in a way that made breathing feel like lifting something heavy off the floor. On the coffee table, my father had left a stack of empty frames and a box labeled Lauren Books, even though the books were mine and the handwriting was my mother's from last spring when she sorted for the church sale. I picked up the frame that used to hold our photo from the first day the dock went in after the ice, and I set it down because my fingers had started to tremble. He came in from the shed with a tape measure hooked to his belt and said he had reached out to the buyers about letting us keep the old canoe because it wasn't part of the listing, and I said, very evenly because I didn't trust my own face, I saw the county records. He smiled without humor. Good. Then you know I did it clean. I said I saw an addendum listed in the trust index with a date from 3 years ago. It isn't in the set you gave me when Mom died. He looked at a point somewhere over my shoulder. Lawyers add junk to cover themselves, he said. Don't go chasing ghosts. I stared at the vein in his temple and felt a tight buzzing in my ears. If you truly believed that, I said, you wouldn't have had me forged as a consenting beneficiary. He flinched like a backstage rope had slipped. Watch your mouth, he said, but it came out small, and I understood in a quiet, steady way that the room was going to tilt. On Thursday, Mr. Halpern's office smelled like paper and coffee and the lemon cleaner every law office in the Midwest seems to use. He's the kind of older man who remembers birthdays and plays in a community band on weekends, and he looked at me with eyes that had watched too many families do math with people's hearts. He pulled our file from a drawer with 2 hands like it was heavy and laid the documents out in order on a table that caught the afternoon light. He found the addendum in under a minute, clipped to the back with a paper clip shaped like a treble clef. My mother would have liked that, and read it aloud so I would hear the words more than once. It gave me the right to match any offer made on the cottage or to approve the sale, and it required my signature for any transfer out of the trust that changed control. He set the paper down and took off his glasses and said, "When did your father tell you he intended to sell?" I swallowed because under the fluorescent hum I could hear the church bell from the next block mark the hour, and it hit me that the bell had marked time for my parents' wedding and my mother's memorial, and now this. On Monday, I said, when he handed me a $15,000 check to live on. Mr. Halpern blinked in that slow lawyer way that's more honest than shock. That's not a distribution, he said. That's a pacifier. And it won't work. He slid a legal pad toward me. Tell me everything you've seen, heard, and smelled, he said, and that last word surprised me enough that I laughed once and had to cover my mouth. Smelled? I asked. Propane, paint, cigarettes. People try to hide things with fresh coats and candles, he said. Details matter. On the way home, the local news on the radio ran a segment about a high school baseball coach retiring, and the announcer's voice caught on a name in a way that felt like grief, and the tenderness of it made my throat tight with the kind of tears that don't go anywhere. When I pulled into my apartment lot, my neighbor was carrying 2 50-pound bags of water softener pellets, and he stopped to say he'd heard about the cottage on the grapevine and asked if I was okay. And I said something non-committal because if I said the wrong word, I was going to end up sitting on the curb crying with a stranger. I went inside and made a grilled cheese and ate it standing up next to the sink, and I took the $15,000 check out of my wallet and laid it on the counter and stared at it until the numbers blurred a little. Then I slid it into a folder marked September because filing things makes me feel like the ground won't shift under my feet. I slept badly and woke twice to the sound of a car door out on the street and the flicker of headlights against my blinds, and each time my heart went fast like I'd missed a cue. By the second weekend of the month, everything that could get complicated started to braid together. My stepbrother Tom, who lives 2 hours south and shows up for holidays and any event where dessert is guaranteed, called to say I was being unfair to Dad and that he had done the best he could with what he had. And then he asked offhand whether the buyers had paid over asking because a friend of his was curious about comps, which told me he had been in the room for more conversations than he wanted to admit. At the grocery store, I ran into Barb from church, who volunteers at the clothing closet, and she touched my elbow in that way people do when they want to comfort you without asking permission, and she said, "Your father has had a terrible summer." And I nodded because I didn't have the energy to give them both the whole picture in the freezer aisle. The police left me a voicemail saying again this was a civil matter, but if I had evidence of identity misrepresentation their detective would be willing to review, and the word misrepresentation sat in my chest like a warm coin. At the end of that day, I stood in my living room, looked at the map of Lake Michigan on the wall, and felt my breathing slow. I didn't have to make noise. I had to make a record. I had an appointment with a lawyer who remembered my mother's handwriting, an addendum that said my consent wasn't optional, and ink on a county record that didn't belong to me even though it wore my name. When Sunday came, I went to church and sat in the back near the fan that clicks every third rotation, and the sermon was about stewardship and small faithfulness and a parable that made the old men nod. After the service, I didn't linger at the coffee table because I knew that would turn into questions, and I drove the 12 miles out to the point and parked on the shoulder by the public access and watched the water from behind my sunglasses like a tourist. 2 kayaks slid by in the middle distance, and a dog barked at cattails on shore, and for a few minutes my body forgot the math. Then a black SUV pulled into the drive, and a couple got out, long limbs and thin jackets and an ease that said weekenders, and they took a photo against the fence with the water behind them like a postcard, and I felt a hot flush move up my neck in a clean line. I didn't get out of the car or shout. I watched. I took a photo of the for sale sign with the small sold sticker at the bottom and the agent's name in a serif font because I didn't have a copy of the listing, and I texted the photo to Aunt Denise with no words. She wrote back, "Halpern 1 p.m. tomorrow. Bring your ID and your patience." I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, leaned back, and let the seatbelt cut a line across my collarbone that reminded me I was still inside my own skin, and I said out loud to no one, "Okay." That's how the first act of the month ended. A diner check in my folder, a cottage with a new lock on Friday, a county record with a loop in my last name that wasn't mine, a lawyer's appointment that could either open a door or show me the wall was higher than I thought. I didn't have a revenge plan the way movies do, with a whiteboard and red string. I had a stack of paper and a feeling in my gut that said the quiet way would work if I didn't get distracted by the noise. When Monday rolled around again, the second Monday of the month this time, I put on a clean shirt, tucked my hair behind my ears, and drove back to town with a thermos of coffee and a folder heavy enough to make my shoulder ache. And I told myself that whatever happened in that office, I would keep my voice even, my hands still, and my eyes on the parts of the story that didn't move when someone tried to talk over them. Mr. Halpern didn't start with promises. He started with a yellow legal pad and a glass of water he set where I could reach it without knocking anything over, and that small mercy steadied me more than a speech would have. He read the addendum again, traced the lines that required my signature for any transfer, and then slid a photocopy of the recorded deed across the table with a pencil mark around the LLC name. He asked for the diner details, the smell in the cottage, the dates on the county site, and the words my father had chosen when he handed me the check. He wrote, "Make it stretch," in tidy block letters, underlined once, and circled the check amount. "We will not argue feelings," he said in that calm way that makes people lean forward. "We will argue dates, signatures, and duties." First steps: a demand letter to your father to preserve all records, a notice to the title company to hold any remaining funds, a request for the notary's journal entry, and a petition in probate to enforce the addendum. If any escrow is still in light, we try to freeze it. If not, we put a constructive trust claim on the proceeds. You will need patience and copies of everything. Can you do patience? My shoulders loosened a notch because at least one person in the room had a map. "I can do paper," I said. "The patience part will take work." By Tuesday afternoon, the paper had started to make its own gravity. The title company's escrow officer called Mr. Halpern and then, with my permission, looped me in, her voice practiced and careful like a flight attendant during turbulence. She confirmed the sale closed 2 Fridays ago, the proceeds wired the same day, and a routine seller holdback of $10,000 remained for a minor dock repair the buyers had flagged, which she would not release until her construction inspector signed off. When I asked where the bulk of the money had gone, she paused just long enough for me to hear the hum behind her before she said the standard line about confidentiality, and then she added, like someone who has read too many cautionary tales, "Your attorney will be able to subpoena a ledger if this proceeds to litigation." She did confirm the notary's name and the date. She said the notary had taken copies of IDs and logged signatures at the cottage on a Wednesday afternoon, which made me frown because that Wednesday I had been at work at the hardware store restocking pallets of 40-pound salt and steel rakes, and my father had texted me about a church meeting that evening and asked if I could drop a pan of brownies by the fellowship hall. Mr. Halpern tapped his pencil against the pad. "Noted," he said. "We'll ask for the notary's journal and the IDs used." I went to the cottage that evening with Aunt Denise because she understands the way rooms hold stories, and she doesn't fill the air with advice when quiet is better. The buyers had left a friendly note again about contractors, this time asking if we could box up the remaining dishes by Thursday because the plumber needed access. In the living room, the TV was set to a baseball replay, the crowd noise low and steady, and the open window let in the smell of the lake and something sharp like paint thinner. We packed in silence for a while until I found a thin accordion folder behind the bookshelf with a rubber band around it and tags on the top that read taxes, cottage, insurance, and utilities, written in my mother's hand and then overwritten more recently with my father's block print. The taxes slot was thinner than it should have been. The insurance slot had a fresh policy dated mid-August with the LLC listed as the insured and an email printed at the bottom from the agent that said, "So sorry about the confusion on the named insured. Glad we got it sorted before closing." I slipped the folder into my tote and felt my pulse quicken in the way it does when you see a shape in the water and don't yet know if it's a log or something alive. We were loading the last box into Aunt Denise's trunk when a black SUV rolled slow up the drive and stopped behind us. The young couple, weekenders, exactly as I'd guessed from their shoes, stepped out. The woman introduced herself with a smile that tried to be kind and careful at the same time. The man kept his hands in his pockets, which always means someone's bracing. "We tried to reach your dad about the doc timeline," she said. I didn't want to be pushy, We just need to schedule our mover, and the inspector said he couldn't clear the holdback until the contractor sends photos. I swallowed, the back of my throat dry. I'm working on paperwork from my side, I said, my voice steady because I'd practiced it in the car. Random question. Who signed the closing documents on the seller's side? If you don't mind telling me. She glanced at her husband and back to me, then said, he did. Mr. Carter. He said you two had it all handled and that he was the trustee. We asked about a beneficiary signature because our agent mentioned it, but the title office said they had what they needed. I'm sorry, this is awkward. I told her I didn't blame them, and I didn't say anything about undoing a sale because that would make them grab their paper and leave, and their version of the truth would fold up in a drawer where I could never reach it. I handed her Mr. Halpern's card and asked her to forward any emails about the doc or the holdback to him. She nodded and said she hoped it worked out for everyone, and the way her voice dipped reminded me that when strangers say everyone, they often mean themselves. On Wednesday, the notary called Mr. Halpern back and agreed to let me and my attorney review the journal entry in her office. The room smelled like toner and peppermint tea. She wore the kind of cardigan women in this county buy during a summer sale and keep wearing until the elbows go shiny. Her journal was neat, lines of names and dates, and when she turned to the page for that Wednesday afternoon, my breath tightened. The first line read Carter, Michael, trustee, Carter Lake Trust. The second line read Carter, Lauren, beneficiary consent, and next to each was the same driver's license number with one digit transposed. A little 8 made to look like a 3 with a heavy stroke. He said you were running late from work, she said, cheeks coloring. He had your ID and the consent ready. I know I'm not supposed to stamp without the person present, I know, but he's a known person in town and he said you were just down the road. He signed his name, and then he signed yours, and I told him you'd need to initial, and he said he'd take care of it when you arrived. I made a note to follow up, and then I got pulled into a refinance next door and I forgot. It was sloppy. I'm sorry. Her voice shrank on the last word. My hands went cold and then hot in a rush that made me want to sit down. Mr. Halpern's face did a controlled stillness I recognized from men who understand that a small clerical sin just grew teeth. We'll be requesting your written statement, he said, soft but clear. You'll want to notify your insurer. She nodded, eyes bright. I already did. The next obstacle hit like a slow-moving truck that still knocks you sideways because you thought you were out of its path. My stepbrother Tom showed up at my apartment Thursday night while I was sorting receipts into piles labeled September and rent and gas, a pizza box balanced on his forearm like a bribe. He started with jokes about how I always liked the mushrooms picked off and then shifted into his message. Dad's in over his head, he said, tone confessional. He had to pay off the last of the machine lease on the shop and Mom's hospital balance we kept getting letters about, and the roof at the house was Patch City. He did what he could with what he had. Don't torch him over a technicality. I stared at the print on the pizza box until the letters stopped swimming. A technicality is my name, I said. A technicality is a signature you knew wasn't mine. He flinched in a way that told me he'd hoped I wouldn't say it out loud. He showed me the spreadsheet, Tom said, bluff increasing as shame did its thing. You're not going to like this part, but I'll say it. He invested in my expansion because the bank wouldn't touch me without collateral. That wasn't theft, that was family. When I get the shop humming by spring, everyone wins. The room thinned. I felt my breathing go shallow. How much, I said, keeping my voice steady by holding the edge of the counter with my left hand. He glanced away, then back. $250, he said like he was guessing my reaction would be worse if he told me slow. He had to move fast. The seller wanted cash. My mouth tasted like a penny. From the cottage, I said. He rubbed his jaw, a tell he shares with my father. From a holding account, he said, which is the same thing said in a way people think sounds smarter. Friday morning, the second Friday of the month, Mr. Halpern filed the petition and a notice of claim on the proceeds, and by that afternoon the title company confirmed in writing that the $10,000 holdback would not be released until the court sorted ownership questions, which meant the buyers were now mildly angry and the agent sent a clipped email about interference. I printed the email and paper-clipped it to the stack with the notary's statement and Tom's $250 scrawled on a sticky note. And I sat on my couch with my knees pulled up like I hadn't done since I was 12, and my mother told me bad news in small pieces and let me pick up the rest when I was ready. The local news at 6 ran a story about a township meeting on Monday, permits for a light industrial space on the edge of town, a contested expansion of a machine shop in a building with old wiring. Tom's shop. The screen showed a photo from the planning packet with his LLC name on it, and the voiceover said the board would be taking public comment. My heart thumped once, hard, in that way that feels like a door opening. I wasn't going to yell about family business into a microphone, but public records don't sweat under bright lights. I circled the date on my calendar and told myself there might be a way to let the truth sit where it belonged without me turning it into a scene. Sunday, I went to church because I needed the bench and the habit. The pew creaked, the hymns came out thin and earnest, and the sermon was about debts and release in a way that made 2 men in the 3rd row fold their arms. After the service, the church treasurer, who has been counting envelopes since I was in pigtails, caught me by the coffee urn and said my father had stepped back from the stewardship committee for a season, her voice careful. And I understood that word had started to move where I couldn't see it. Aunt Denise pressed a folded note into my palm in the parking lot. Inside was a copy of a bank wire advice she said she found in a folder in my father's desk that she'd been told to drop off with Halpern, $240, 0002, TC Manufacturing LLC, the day after closing, memo line investment. Her handwriting underlined the date twice. I read it once and then again and felt my pulse slow, and a clear thought came like a clean edge. I didn't have to blow anything up. I just had to stand where the microphones were when the facts gathered. Monday evening, the township room smelled like dust and paper coffee cups and nervous sweat. Farmers in ball caps sat next to retirees in fleece vests, and a teenager in a marching band hoodie played with a fidget toy while her mother filled out a comment card. The agenda said public hearing, TC Manufacturing, use variance for expansion, and when they called the case, Tom walked to the front in a button-down that still had fold lines from the package and tried to keep his shoulders square. He talked about jobs and local pride and how he'd been here since he was a kid, and then the board asked about financing because the building needed a full electrical upgrade and a sprinkler system would run north of $85,000. Tom said he had family investors, and my chest tightened at the neatness of that phrase. When they opened it for public comment, Mr. Halpern squeezed my elbow once and nodded at the podium. I stood there with a stack of copies I had made for the clerk because this county loves its copies. I didn't look at Tom. I didn't look for my father. I kept my voice measured and my sentences plain. My name is Lauren Carter, I said. I am a resident of the township. I'm here to place into the record documents that may be relevant to the board's decision about the source and stability of the financing for this expansion. I handed the clerk the packet. The wire advice from the escrow to LLC transfer, the addendum requiring my consent for the sale of the cottage, the notary's written statement about the journal entry with my name signed in my father's hand, and the probate petition number. I didn't make speeches. I said, I am not here to discuss private family matters. I am here to ensure that public decisions rest on verified sources of capital that won't be clawed back mid-project. The room went very still in that way it does when people understand there is more under the surface and they are deciding whether to move closer or back away. The board chair, a woman who used to teach me civics, thanked me for the documents and asked a question I hadn't even let myself hope for. Do you have counsel? she said. "We may need to speak to him." I gave her Mr. Halpern's card without my hand shaking. I went home from the meeting tired all the way into my bones, the kind of tired that comes after you hold your body too still for too long. On the way, the radio carried a call-in about the high school's homecoming game and someone's memory of a 40-yard pass thrown in the rain in '98, and the ordinary nostalgia of it kept me from either crying or laughing, which both felt too big. When I pulled into my lot, my father's truck was parked crooked across two spots, and he was sitting on the tailgate with his head down, elbows on knees, hands clasped like a man in a waiting room. He stood when I got out and said my name in a voice I recognized from when I broke my wrist falling off the dock the summer I turned 9. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No heat, just a tremor. You could have come to me." I kept a good 3 feet between us because that distance felt true. "I did," I said. "At a diner, at the Cottage, at your house. You kept smiling and saying timing is everything. The board needed to know where the money came from. That's all I did." He rubbed the back of his neck like he could erase the day. "You're going to ruin your brother," he said, and the word brother scraped a little on its way out because Tom and I have never been good at that label. "Tom is 32, I said. "He can run a shop on honest numbers or not run one at all. I am not the one who used my name like tape." He looked past me to the apartments, the lit squares of other people's kitchens where dinners were happening and TVs tried to keep the room company, and when he looked back his face had the small, shocked helplessness I've only seen twice. Once when the dog didn't come back, once at the graveside when the wind took his hat. "I did not think this would break you like this," he said, and that word, break, made something in my chest sting. "It didn't," I said, and I meant it more than I thought I would. "It changed me. There's a difference." He left without shouting. I went inside and put my folder on the table and stared at my mother's addendum one more time with the treble clef paperclip shining in the lamplight. The next steps would not be quick. Mr. Halpern had said weeks and hearings and possible mediation, and I had told him I could do patience if I could keep my job and my rent paid and my head clear. I put the $15,000 check into an envelope labeled hold and slid it into the drawer with my passport and the spare key to the storage unit where the quilts now sat in 2 tidy bins. The lake was 2 miles away as the crow flies. The buyers were probably measuring their new deck for chairs. The dock repair inspector was holding a check in limbo, and somewhere in town a planning board was reading a packet with my name in a sentence I didn't write. Part of me wanted to throw up, and part of me wanted to sleep for 12 hours. I did neither. I set my alarm for 6 because the hardware store expected me on the floor at 7, and the guy who orders concrete mix had a habit of calling in sick on Tuesdays. That was the middle of it. The second act wrapped around the third like reeds around a piling, obstacles that made my jaw tight. A notary who told the truth even when it cost her, an ally and a lawyer who moved his pencil like a conductor, and a township room where I let the public part of the story be public. There was more coming, because that's how months work, they stack. When the last Thursday before payday rolled around and Mr. Halpern called with a single line, "There's movement at the bank," I felt that small, precise lift behind the breastbone you get when the inning isn't over and the batter has a count he likes. I told him I could be at his office in 20 minutes. He said, "Come. Bring your patience." I took a sip of water, picked up my folder, and locked my door with a steady hand. Mr. Halpern's movement at the bank turned out to be a compliance flag that had popped the previous afternoon when our petition hit their legal inbox, 2 wires out from the Cottage proceeds into 2 different accounts on the same day, one to my father's personal checking and one to Tom's LLC, and a third, smaller transfer into an account at a credit union I didn't recognize. The bank had placed a temporary administrative hold pending clarification and had emailed him for documentary support. He slid the printouts across the table and let me read them twice, because he knows that's how I steady my breathing, and when I looked up he said, in that calm tone that somehow makes your shoulders drop, "We have a 5-day window to convert this into an order. If we don't, this hold evaporates. I can ask the probate judge for an emergency hearing Wednesday at 9. If your father wants to talk before then, I'll listen. If he doesn't, we go in with the record we have." I nodded because a plan with clock hands felt like oxygen. We spent the next hour building a timeline on a white pad, diner check on the first Monday after Labor Day, recorded deed 2 Fridays ago, notary journal on that Wednesday, wire the next day, township hearing this Monday. He added a thin arrow at the end that said Wednesday X part relief, and my palms went damp in a sudden rush that made me grip the arm of the chair until it passed. Tuesday night, the hardware store was busy with people buying mums and furnace filters because the forecast said our first 50-degree morning would land by the weekend. I moved pallets, scanned tags, answered 3 variations of "What size is my filter if the box is gone?" and tried not to think about court. The local news at 6 ran weather, and then a segment about the high school marching band's fundraiser breakfast this Saturday, the same breakfast where the PDA had handed me my check in the last story I told. And the mention of folding tables and syrup steadied me enough to finish my shift without losing the thread of what was in front of me. When I got home, there was a single text from my father that said, "We can settle this and nothing else," and my hands started to sweat again because settle from him usually means stop making a fuss and take what I offer. I put my phone face down and washed the smell of fertilizer out of my hair and ate a bowl of cereal standing up at the sink because anything more ambitious would have made me feel like I was pretending this was a normal week. We stood in front of the probate judge at 9 sharp on Wednesday morning, the last Wednesday of the month, and the room smelled like old wood and coffee and whatever polish the bailiff likes to use on the railing. My father sat at the other table in his one good jacket, jaw set, eyes ringed like he hadn't slept, and his attorney, a man I remembered from Chamber of Commerce breakfasts, shuffled papers and kept his hand on the file like it was going to bolt. "Mr. Halpern laid out our timeline, not loud, not soft, just steady. Addendum requiring my consent. No consent given. Notary journal with my name written by someone else. Deed to an LLC controlled by my father. Sale to bona fide purchasers. Wire out the next day to a family member's business, a bank hold, a township board concerned about funding integrity." He did not say forged because he didn't have to. The judge could read. The other side called it a misunderstanding, a deviation from perfect process under time pressure, a father who had managed assets prudently in a fluctuating market. And when my father's attorney said the buying couple had closed in good faith and unwinding the sale would punish innocent parties, Mr. Halpern nodded and said we weren't there to unwind anything. We were there to trace and protect proceeds and to enforce the right of first refusal that had been bypassed. The judge asked 3 questions that cut through a week of noise like a box cutter. Did the addendum require my signature to transfer the cottage out of the trust? Yes. Did the notary's journal show that I had not been present when my name was recorded? Yes. Did the bank confirm an administrative hold on proceeds in accounts controlled by my father and my stepbrother's company? Yes. He leaned back, looked over his glasses at my father the way teachers do when they want you to stop talking before you start, and then he granted an order that did exactly what we had asked for and nothing more. A temporary injunction on any transfer out of the 2 identified accounts, an order to the title company to deliver the $10,000 holdback to the trust pending allocation, a directive removing my father as sole trustee and appointing Mr. Halpern interim co-trustee with authority to receive and safeguard all funds, and a requirement that my father produce within 5 days a full ledger of the sale, the LLC, and any disbursements, with receipts. He did not thunder. He spoke like a man confirming a schedule. When he finished, my shoulders dropped in a way that made me aware of muscles I hadn't known were clenched. We walked out into the hallway where the fluorescent lights hum and people wait on benches for their names to be called, and my father followed, not fast, hands open like a man approaching a dog he's afraid will bite. "You could have told me you were going to do this," he said, voice low, eyes on the floor, because he has always hated people seeing him off balance. "I tried," I said. "At the diner, at the cottage, at your house, in the parking lot outside my apartment." You wanted me to say okay and smile. I didn't have it in me. He rubbed the back of his neck until the skin went red and said the words that made my stomach twist more than the fight had. "I thought I had time to fix it before you noticed." There wasn't anything to say to that. Mr. Halpern handed me a copy of the order and told me to go get some air and a sandwich, and I did, because when a person who's kept your feet on the floor tells you to eat, you should probably eat. Before the end of the day, a second thing fell into place in the way papers sometimes click together like dominoes. The township emailed to say the board had tabled Tom's variance until financing clarity, citing open litigation affecting a major share of the project's stated capital, and they asked for updates by the second Monday next month. I printed the email and slid it into the folder under a tab I labeled board, and I stood for a second with my hand on the file and felt a complicated mix of relief and a small, sharp sadness for a version of a life where my brother and I weren't standing on opposite sides of a room holding different parts of the same story. At dusk, on my way back from the bank where I had signed something that made the injunction real to a teller who kept her voice chipper, I stopped at the public access and leaned against the railing and watched two boys throw a baseball back and forth until it got too dark to see the seams. The geese argued among themselves. Someone grilled in a yard up the road, and the smell drifted over with a sweetness that made my chest hurt. I put my palm flat on the cold top rail and said out loud, because I wanted to hear the words in the air, "We are going to be okay," and I surprised myself by believing it. By Friday, last Friday before payday, my father's attorney called Mr. Halpern with what he called a global proposal, and we sat at a long conference table in a neutral office that smelled like fresh carpet and vending machine coffee, while men in dress shirts tried not to sigh too loudly. The buyers couldn't and shouldn't be uprooted. Everyone agreed on that. The proceeds would be traced and divided under the trust, less standard costs, with my share paid into a dedicated trust account with Mr. Halpern as trustee until I chose to distribute. And the bank would release the holds in stages as money moved where it should have gone the first time. Tom's $240,000 would be subject to a constructive trust and converted into a secured note in favor of my trust, with a recorded lien against his equipment and a payment schedule that didn't care how busy January got. My father would resign as trustee and sign a written apology acknowledging the addendum, the notary issue, and the misallocation. It would live in the file with my mother's handwriting and the treble clef paperclip where it belonged. The $10,000 doc holdback would cure itself to the trust, and Tom's variance would be revisited when he could show a bank letter that didn't include the word family in the line where secured collateral should be. Somebody asked if I wanted an apology in person, and I said I wanted one on paper and a quiet house at Christmas. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room shifted, which is its own kind of laugh in places like that. The hardest part of the next week was the waiting while wires crawled and signatures looped through offices. I went to work, stocked snow shovels and driveway salt because the temperature had started to drop. Ate pasta from a plastic container at my break table while the small TV in the corner played a replay of last night's game where a rookie hit his first home run and grinned like he didn't know what to do with his face. And when customers asked about sizes, I answered like my life wasn't sitting on hold music somewhere between departments. Aunt Denise came by one evening with a casserole and a stack of church bulletins, and we ate in silence for a few minutes until she said, like a person who knows how to touch a bruise without making the whole limb ache. Your mother would be proud of you for choosing paper over fireworks, and I put my fork down because if I didn't, I was going to miss my mouth. I thought about my mother's way of solving problems, lists, calendars, gentle persistence, and my chest warmed in a way that made my eyes sting. When the money finally landed, the second Monday of the next month, early afternoon, I was at the bank with Mr. Halpern, and the teller, who had seen me 3 times in 8 days, smiled with that professional brightness that softens into something more human when they print a receipt with a number that makes people sway. We signed the trust account documents. He slid me a check for an initial distribution enough to change the shape of my month without setting me adrift, and said the rest would sit until the court closed the file and the note from Tom got recorded. I pulled the $15,000 diner check from my folder, still crisp in a way that felt wrong, and handed it back across the table to my father's attorney, who had come to make sure the wires hit the right ledger. Void it, I said, and when he nodded and placed it carefully into his file, I felt a small heat in my chest that was not anger, exactly, more like closure. My father was not there. He had sent a letter, neat and short, with apology words that read like a man had had to practice them, and I tucked it into the folder under my mother's addendum because I wanted them to face each other for a while before I put anything away. The denouement didn't arrive with trumpets or a parade. It landed in small corners. The buyers sent a kind note through Mr. Halpern offering to let me take the old canoe after all if I had a place to store it. And I cried a little at my kitchen table thinking about that dent along the starboard side and how it had gotten there when I was 12 and insisted on staring. Tom texted me a photo of the lien file number stamped at the top of his county record. No words, and I sat with the strange mix of pity and relief in my chest until it settled. The township posted the agenda for the next meeting and TC Manufacturing wasn't on it, and the local paper ran a tiny square of text about additional review that probably only 10 people read. And somehow that felt better than any headline would have. On the last Thursday of that second month, I put a deposit on a small, drafty bungalow 5 miles inland with a yard just big enough for a grill and 2 lawn chairs and a garage where, someday, if I wanted, I could store a canoe. I signed the lease with a pen that scratched, slid the treble clef paperclip back into my folder, and stood for a minute in the empty living room listening to the radiator tick and the neighbor's TV drift through the wall, baseball, low and warm. And I felt my shoulders lower in a way they hadn't in weeks. Sunday, I went to church and sat in the back again, and the usher with the tired eyes shook my hand and asked about my aunt in that quiet way people ask when they care, but don't want a story in the narthex. After the service, I drove out to the public access at the point and watched the water for 10 minutes, and then I drove home past a garage sale where someone was selling a set of mismatched mugs and a stack of frames that looked a lot like the ones we'd boxed at the cottage. I bought a mug with a chip on the handle because it fit my hand the way my mother's old one did. That night, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup and ate at my new table with the window cracked, and when the late local news read the baseball scores, I felt my breathing go even and my palms dry. Revenge, if that's what anyone wants to call it, looked small and steady in the end. A paper trail that held, a trust that did what it was supposed to do, a father who had to sit with the file where his name looked less like a fix and more like a warning. A brother who had to build his business on a ledger that didn't wobble, a lake where the dock creaked at night whether I was there or not. I didn't get my cottage back. I got my footing. And when Antonice came by on the first Monday of the next month with a bag of apples and asked if the canoe would fit in her garage for the winter if I wanted to keep it, I said yes, and the yes sat in my mouth like something solid you can bite into and trust.